Chapter 11. The Follower's Path. The train carried Julian north through a landscape that had surrendered to winter. The fields beyond the window white and featureless. The occasional farmhouse rising from the snow like a monument to some forgotten faith. He sat in a window seat, his reflection ghosting across the glass, and watched the miles accumulate with the dull awareness of a man who had stopped caring about destinations. The conference in Chicago had been weeks ago now, but the memory of Elias's betrayal still burned in his chest like a coal that refused to cool, and he had spent every intervening day trying to find a way to extinguish it. He had failed. The coal was still there, hot and insistent, and it had begun to reshape him in ways he had not anticipated. He thought about the auditorium, about the moment Elias had stepped up to the podium and spoken those terrible words, the words that had shattered everything Julian had built his life around. He thought about the expression on Elias's face, that hollow, exhausted look that had replaced the fierce certainty of the man who had written the manifesto, and he thought about the way the audience had erupted, the way the believers had turned to each other with their faces full of confusion and fear, the way everything they had believed had crumbled in the space of a single speech. He thought about the aftermath, the frantic calls from other followers, the desperate attempts to salvage something from the wreckage, the endless debates about what it all meant and where they went from here. He had participated in those debates, had argued with a ferocity that surprised even him, had tried to convince the others that Elias's confession was nothing more than the ravings of a dying man, a man who had been weakened by pain and medication, and the fear of his own mortality. But the arguments had rung hollow, even to his own ears. He had heard the doubt creeping into his voice, the uncertainty that had never been there before, and he had hated himself for it. He had hated Elias for putting him in this position, for building the philosophy, and then tearing it down, for giving him a purpose, and then taking it away. He hated Elias, and he loved Elias, and he did not know how to hold both emotions in the same chest without them tearing him apart. The train arrived at the station in the late afternoon, and Julian stepped onto the platform with the stiff, mechanical movements of a man who had been sitting too long. The air was cold, sharp against his face, and he pulled his coat tighter around his shoulders as he walked through the station and out into the street. The city was gray and muted, the buildings hunched against the sky, the pedestrians moving with a hurried shuffle of people who had places to be and no time to get there. He had chosen this city deliberately, had chosen it because it was far from Chicago, far from the reminders of the conference, far from the ghosts of the philosophy that had once been his anchor. He had chosen it because he needed to think, needed to plan, needed to figure out what came next, what came after the confession, what came after the destruction of everything he had believed. He walked through the streets, his hands in his pockets, his breath forming small clouds in the cold air. He passed a woman pushing a stroller, a young couple holding hands, an old man walking his dog. He saw them, these people living their lives, making their choices, creating their futures, and he felt the same cold anger that had been building inside him since the conference. They were the problem. They were the ones who kept creating, kept bringing children into the world, kept perpetuating the cycle of suffering that Elias had spent his life trying to stop. And Elias had failed. Elias had given up. Elias had surrendered to the very illusions he had spent his life dismantling. Julian would not make the same mistake. The apartment was small, sparsely furnished, the kind of place that could be abandoned without regret. Julian had rented it sight unseen, had chosen it because it was cheap and anonymous, and because he did not plan to stay long. He dropped his bag on the floor and stood in the center of the room, looking at the empty walls, the bare floor, the single window that looked out onto a brick wall. The space was the physical manifestation of his state of mind. Stripped bare, hollowed out, waiting for something to fill it. He sat down on the floor, cross-legged, and closed his eyes. He had been doing this a lot lately, sitting in silence, trying to find his way back to the certainty that had once defined him. He had been doing it because he needed to think, needed to plan, needed to figure out what came next. And slowly, over the days that followed, the plan began to take shape. It started with a question. What was the logical conclusion of the philosophy? Elias had argued that procreation was a moral wrong, that the only ethical choice was to refrain from creating new life. But he had stopped there. He had stopped at the argument, at the intellectual exercise, at the comfortable distance of theory. He had never taken the next step. He had never asked the question that Julian was now asking himself. If procreation was wrong, if creating new life was a moral evil, then what about the lives that already existed? What about the suffering that was already happening? What about the children who were being born every day? The children who would grow up to suffer and die? The children who had never asked to be born? Julian thought about the asymmetry of pain, about the argument that Elias had built his life around. The presence of pain is bad. The absence of pain is good. The presence of pleasure is good. But the absence of pleasure is not bad unless there is a being who exists to miss it. He thought about that argument, and he thought about the logical conclusion that Elias had never been willing to draw. If the absence of pain is good, and if the absence of pleasure is not bad, then the only way to guarantee the absence of pain is to ensure that no beings exist to experience it. The only way to end suffering is to end life. He thought about this, and he felt the certainty return, cold and hard and absolute. He felt the certainty return, and he knew what he had to do. He began to write. The letters went out to the followers, the ones who had been at the conference, the ones who had believed, the ones who had been shaken by Elias's confession. He wrote to them with the old fervor, the old conviction, the old certainty that had been his anchor before Elias had torn it away. He told them that Elias was wrong, that the confession was a betrayal, that the philosophy was still true, even if its founder had lost his faith. He told them that they could not give up, could not surrender, could not let the cause die. He told them that they had to act. The responses came slowly at first, then faster, a flood of emails and phone calls and messages from believers who had been waiting for someone to lead them out of the darkness. They had been lost, adrift, their faith shattered by Elias's confession. But Julian gave them something to hold on to. Julian gave them a new purpose. Julian gave them a plan. The plan was simple. The plan was terrifying. The plan was the logical conclusion of everything they had ever believed. They would not just talk about the asymmetry of pain. They would not just write about the non-consensual gamble, about the certainty of suffering. They would act, and they would show the world that they meant what they said. They would show the world that the only way to end suffering was to end life. Julian worked in a fever, the certainty burning through him like a fire that could not be extinguished. He spent his days writing, planning, organizing. He spent his nights pacing the small apartment, unable to sleep, unable to stop the cascade of thoughts that poured through his mind. He thought about Elias and the betrayal, about the confession that had shattered everything. He thought about the followers and their desperate need for guidance, their hunger for something to believe in. He thought about the world and its endless, pointless suffering, the suffering that could be ended if only someone had the courage to do what needed to be done. He thought about the children, the unborn children who would never suffer because he would make sure of it, the children who would never be born because he would stop the cycle, the children who would never experience the pain, the loss, the fear, the certainty of death. He thought about them, and he felt something that might have been love. It was a twisted love, a love that had been corrupted by years of hatred and despair, but it was love nonetheless. It was the love of a man who believed he was saving the world. It was the love of a man who believed he was doing the right thing. He thought about the love, and he knew what he had to do. The first stage of the plan was simple. He would recruit. He would gather the believers, the ones who had been shaken but not broken, the ones who were willing to do what needed to be done. He would build a network of followers who shared his conviction, who were willing to act. who were willing to make the sacrifices that Elias had never been willing to make. He would give them a purpose. He would give them a mission. He would give them the certainty that Elias had taken away. He started small, reaching out to the followers he trusted most, the ones who had been with him since the beginning. He brought them to the apartment, one by one, and he laid out the plan. He watched their faces as he spoke, watched the fear and the doubt and the excitement flicker across their features. He watched them struggle with what he was asking, struggle with the enormity of it, struggle with the logical conclusion of everything they had ever believed, and one by one, they agreed. The plan grew. It expanded, taking on new dimensions, new possibilities, new forms. Julian worked with a single-minded intensity that surprised even him, pouring all of his energy into the cause, refusing to let anything distract him from the mission. He did not sleep. He did not eat. He did not stop. He thought about Elias, about the man who had built the philosophy and then abandoned it. He thought about the betrayal, the confession, the destruction of everything Julian had believed. He thought about the anger that burned inside him, the anger that had become his fuel, his motivation, his reason for continuing. He thought about the anger, and he let it consume him. The plan would succeed. It had to succeed. The world was suffering, and only they could stop it. The world was suffering, and they would save it, whether the world wanted to be saved or not. Julian stood in the window of his apartment, looking out at the gray city, the gray sky, the gray world that was waiting for him. He felt the certainty burning inside him, hot and bright, a fire that would not be extinguished. He thought about Elias, about the man who had given him everything and taken it all away. He thought about the followers, about the believers who had placed their faith in him. He thought about the children, the unborn children who would never suffer because he would make sure of it. He thought about all of it, and he knew what he had to do. The plan would succeed. The world would be saved. And when it was done, when the suffering had ended, when the cycle had been broken, he would finally find the peace that had eluded him his entire life. He would find the peace, and he would never have to think about Elias again.